The European Union and Viktor Orban continue to antagonize each other. Is the EU wanting to punish the Hungarian people to create political pressure? Hungary's Prime Minister Viktor Orban will serve as the European Union's president for the remainder of 2024 as part of the bloc's rotating six-month presidency rule. Mr. Orban, in his time as president, has traveled to Kyiv, Moscow, and Beijing with one of his goals to clear obstacles that are preventing the start of peace talks to end the war in Ukraine. This has immediately put him in a proverbial European Union doghouse as the European Union and Commission leaders right away criticized Orban's use of the EU presidency to bring new attention to seeking peace to end the Ukraine war. His troubles did not end there. He continues an ongoing dispute with the EU over Hungary's immigration policy and his country's reliance on Russian oil for Hungary's energy needs. The EU's ongoing disputes with Hungary and its prime minister have escalated to the point where they are willing to make life more difficult for Hungarian citizens by forcing Hungary's majority to comply with Brussels rules. This behavior from EU leadership raises questions about how committed the EU is to the rule of law as well as legal dissent from member states. The European Court of Justice, the top court in the EU, in June 2024 issued a €200 million fine, $216 million, and a daily €1 million, $1.1 million US dollars fine against Hungary for its non-compliance with EU's asylum rules. This is an ongoing dispute with roots dating back to 2015 migrant surge, which came primarily from North Africa and areas impacted by the Syrian civil war. This is the second time the court has ruled against Hungary, the first being in 2020. The EU implemented a lenient policy allowing asylum seekers to travel to Europe as a means of escaping conflicts or conditions resulting from them. Hungary, because it was on the EU's border, was to be considered a transit country, a location where migrants would come to submit their asylum claims. We expected them to remain in Hungary until we reviewed their claims and made a preliminary determination about their status, which would either force them to leave the EU or allow them to transit to other parts of the EU until the cases were fully adjudicated. The stay in Hungary policy did not sit well with Hungary's leadership, which built a wall and a supporting infrastructure to keep what it viewed as illegal entries out of Hungary and therefore the EU if they did not follow Hungary's immigration laws. Hungary's laws required asylum seekers seeking entry into the country to make an asylum application at its embassies in non-EU countries on its borders, which includes Serbia and Ukraine. Hungary will then decide for applicants while they wait in a third country. Hungary argues that its borders, particularly those of non-EU countries, are its sovereign rights to maintain and defend, and that the EU cannot mandate how it chooses to manage its international borders. This is a legitimate argument as Hungary is responsible for managing its affairs with non-EU neighbors when EU jurisdiction ends. Additionally, the EU does not maintain a military to protect its member countries' borders, and Frontex does not have authority over the border unless an EU member country is no longer effective in controlling its borders. This again reinforces that EU borders with non-EU countries are the sovereign rights of that particular country, and in this case, Hungary. The international border is a clear gray area when it comes to EU rules. While it is true that EU member countries relinquish many of the sovereign rights upon joining, one could argue that EU possesses the authority to establish a bloc-wide immigration policy and that the criminal court is correct. However, the partner nation is responsible for managing the international border where the EU authority ends. The EU lacks the capacity and authority to defend an international border as its borders require defense and control for both defense and migration flow. Since NATO and the EU are distinct political entities, it is not possible to use NATO resources to enforce EU policies or control a member country's borders, such as Hungary, which is both an EU and a NATO country. The Criminal Court of Justice, being far from a neutral arbiter, ruled in favor of the EU against Hungary, which also left Hungary in a position where it is responsible for its international border, but only to the extent that Brussels wants Hungary to determine how to manage its international border. Currently, Mr. Orban's government is paying a daily fine and controlling its border. However, they have stated they cannot continue to pay the fine indefinitely and may agree to the court's ruling. Instead of leaving asylum applicants in Hungary, however, they are considering transporting them to the EU headquarters in Brussels, a reminiscent move of Texas Governor Greg Abbott. The ongoing dispute between Budapest and Brussels also revolves around the issue of Russian oil imports. When the Ukraine war broke out in February 2022, the EU made its policy to have the bloc become independent of Russian oil and gas. The EU had to impose two conditions to implement this policy, one of which was to permit Hungary and Slovakia to continue to receiving Russian oil. Last month, the EU decided to sanction Russian oil, Lukoil, which resulted in Ukraine blocking this Russian oil pipeline that transits Ukraine to Hungary and Slovakia. The Ukrainians admit they shut down the pipeline in compliance with the EU sanctions. Hungary has proposed to buy the oil before it enters Ukraine, allowing it to be identified as Hungarian oil rather than Russian Lukoil. This approach is similar to what other EU countries do when they purchase oil and gas from Russia. The EU's refusal to intervene and negotiate the issue, rather than directly rejecting this, has sparked suspicions that the EU is trying to compel Hungary and Slovakia to cease buying Russian oil, even though they have permission to do so. Hungary and Slovakia are two EU countries that maintain relatively close ties to Russia when compared to the rest of the EU, and this has been a source of contention. That is why it is suspected that this is an attempt by the EU to tighten sanctions, despite its agreement with Hungary and Slovakia, that are meant not only to punish Russia, but also its two members' populations to have them, in turn against their government. Hungary has responded by accusing the EU leadership in Brussels of being responsible for this. It has declared that it will utilize its veto power to prevent the distribution of 6.5 billion euros, $7 billion US dollars, from the European Peace Facility for Ukraine aid, and it will persist in doing so until the EU fulfills its agreement with the country. Ukraine remains unaffected by this, however, because the blocking of this aid, as its purpose is to reimburse EU countries that have already made their donations to Ukraine. Slovakia, which is actually more dependent on Russian oil than Hungary, is in response has stated that it will also block disbursement of this fund, but also requested Ukraine to allow the oil to flow from the pipeline, and it reminded Ukraine that Slovakia is a significant supplier of Ukrainian electricity. This is not insignificant, as the Russian air and missile campaign has focused much of its efforts on destroying the Ukraine's infrastructure for power, leaving it dependent on countries like Slovakia to offset its energy deficits. Ukraine's government response is that this is largely an internal political issue between the EU and its member countries, as it states that Lukoil's pipeline shutoff had no significant impact on the flow of Russian oil that travels on pipelines crossing over Ukraine territory. The EU has been largely silent on Hungary and Slovakia's new rhetoric over asylum and oil. The EU has enforced two major decisions impacting Hungary despite there being significant issues with their rulings over the questions of control of an international border or ignoring its own ruling on Russian oil exceptions to make a political point against Prime Minister Viktor Orban. The EU's recent actions aim not to directly affect Hungary's leadership, but rather to lower the living standards of Hungarians and Slovakians, thereby fostering a political rift from the bottom up, as their directives from the above have failed to bring about the desired transformation in Budapest. Hungary has made a number of concerning decisions, including allowing Chinese police to patrol the country under a dubious guise of assisting Chinese tourists, and accepting funds from China for the Belt and Road Initiative, which has drawn criticism. However, the EU leadership's decision to complicate the lives of ordinary citizens due to a political disagreement reveals a level of authoritarianism that warrants scrutiny and challenge.